The battlefield was silent now. Smoke drifted in the cold night air, covering the ground in a thick fog of death. Broken weapons, shattered armor, and the bodies of fallen warriors lay scattered everywhere. The Great War had ended, but not in humanity's favor. The enemy had been ruthless, their numbers overwhelming. The human army had fought bravely, but in the end, they were crushed. Among the wreckage, a single knight still breathed. Barely. His armor was cracked, the once shining metal now covered in blood and dirt. His sword lay beside him, broken in two. His body refused to move, pain screaming through every muscle. He tried to lift his head, but even that felt impossible. The enemy had left him to die. They had thought he was finished, not worth the effort of a final strike. He was just another fallen soldier in a war that had already been lost. No one would come for him. No one would remember his name. A cold wind swept across the battlefield, chilling his skin. He wanted to stay awake, to fight against the darkness creeping into his vision. But his body was giving up. His heartbeat slowed. His breath became shallow. Was this how it was going to end? A warrior who had sworn to protect his people, left alone in the dirt like a forgotten corpse. He had dreamed of dying in glory, sword in hand, standing tall against his enemies. Instead, he was lying here, broken and useless, his vision blurred. His mind felt heavy. Then he heard it, a deep, rumbling sound. At first, he thought it was the wind, but then the ground trembled beneath him. It was faint, but there, heavy footsteps, growing louder. The night forced his eyes open. Shadows moved in the smoke. Massive shapes. They were not human. The knight's breath caught in his throat. He had seen many creatures in his lifetime, but these were something else. Towering figures with long, powerful limbs, wings that stretched wide, blocking the moonlight, eyes that glowed in the darkness like burning embers. Dragons. His blood turned to ice. The ancient beasts, feared by many, had arrived. But why? The war was over. The battlefield had nothing left to offer. Unless they were here for him. The largest of them stepped forward, its massive claws sinking into the ground. Its scales shimmered in the faint light, a dark color with veins of fire running beneath. It lowered its head, bringing its glowing eyes level with the dying knight. The knight wanted to move, wanted to reach for his sword, even if it was broken. But his body refused to obey. He was powerless. If these creatures wanted to end him, he wouldn't be able to stop them. For a long moment, the dragon simply stared at him. Then it did something unexpected. It spoke, not in growls or roars, but in a deep, ancient voice that sent shivers down the knight's spine. "You are not dead yet, human." The knight's breath hitched. "But you will be, unless you accept what we offer." The words were not a threat. They were something else. A test. A challenge. The knight didn't understand. Why would dragons care about a dying human? What could they possibly offer? His vision darkened again. His body was slipping away. He didn't have time to ask. The dragon's eyes burned brighter. Then the world exploded in fire. And the knight knew nothing more. Pain. It was the first thing he felt. A deep, burning pain that spread through every inch of his body like fire coursing through his veins. His mind struggled to wake up, but the pain was everywhere. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. It was like being trapped between life and death, where neither would take him. Then, suddenly, it was gone. His eyes shot open, and he gasped, sucking in a sharp breath as if he had been drowning. He expected to see the battlefield, the broken weapons, the corpses, the cold night sky. But he wasn't there anymore. A dim golden light surrounded him. The air was thick and warm, filled with a strange energy that made his skin tingle. The walls around him shimmered, as if made of living stone, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. He was lying on a surface that felt soft, yet firm, like it had been shaped specifically for him. He tried to move, expecting the sharp pain of his wounds to stop him, but there was none. His body felt whole, strong. He lifted his hands, staring at them in disbelief. The cuts and bruises were gone. The deep wounds that should have killed him were nothing but faint scars. It didn't make sense. He had been dying. A deep voice echoed through the chamber. "You wake faster than we expected, human." His breath caught in his throat. Slowly, he turned his head. The dragon was there. The same massive creature that had stood over him on the battlefield, its burning eyes staring into his soul. But now he could see it clearly. Its scales were a deep, shimmering black, lined with veins of glowing gold. Its wings were folded neatly against its back. But even like this, it radiated an overwhelming presence, like a force of nature itself. The knight struggled to find words. Where am I?" His voice was hoarse, weak compared to the power in the dragon's gaze. "You are within the heart chamber," the dragon said, "a place few living beings have ever seen." The knight's mind raced. He had heard myths of the dragon's hidden sanctuaries, ancient places filled with magic and mystery, but no human had ever been taken to one. They were sacred, forbidden. He sat up slowly, his body still adjusting to the strange energy in the air. "Why am I here? You should have left me to die." The dragon's expression didn't change. "You were dying, but your fight was not finished, so we gave you a choice." The knight frowned. "A choice? I don't remember making one." The dragon's golden eyes burned brighter. "No, but your soul did." A heavy silence filled the chamber. The knight didn't understand. What had they done to him? How had he survived? He clenched his fists, trying to make sense of it. His body felt different, stronger, more alive than ever before. There was something inside him, something powerful. The dragon took a step forward, its claws clicking against the stone. "You were broken, dying, abandoned by your own kind, but we saw something in you, something that should not be wasted." The knight swallowed hard. "What did you do to me?" The dragon studied him for a long moment before speaking. "We gave you the flame." A chill ran down the knight's spine. He had heard legends of the flame, the lifeblood of the dragons, the source of their strength, their immortality. It was sacred, untouchable. No human could ever wield it. And yet, he felt it. Deep inside him, a warmth burned, waiting. He shook his head. "No, that's impossible." The dragon's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Is it?" The knight gritted his teeth. He didn't know what was happening to him, but he could feel it. This power wasn't normal. It wasn't human. It was something else, something ancient and alive. His hands trembled as he clenched them into fists. "Why me?" he asked finally. The dragon's gaze didn't waver. "Because war is coming, and you will stand at its center." The knight's chest tightened. War. He had already fought in one. He had already lost everything. What more could he give? But deep down, he knew the answer. Everything. The dragon took another step closer, its massive form casting a shadow over him. "You were left to die, but fate had other plans. You are no longer just a knight. You are something more." The knight exhaled, his heart pounding. He didn't understand what he had become. He didn't know what the dragons wanted from him. But one thing was certain. His story wasn't over yet. Not even close. And whatever happened next, the entire world would feel it. The knight's breath came in slow, measured gasps as he stared at his hands. They looked the same, scared, calloused, human. But he knew something had changed. Deep inside his chest, something pulsed, something alive. It wasn't just his heartbeat. It was more. His fingers trembled as he clenched them into fists. The warmth inside him flickered, like embers waiting to ignite. The dragon's words echoed in his mind. "We gave you the flame." He still didn't understand. He had heard the myths, the legends of dragonfire, a power that could burn through steel, melt mountains, and turn warriors into gods. But it wasn't meant for humans. It wasn't possible. And yet, the knight slowly pushed himself to his feet. His movements felt lighter, stronger, as if his body had been reforged from within. He glanced up at the massive dragon watching him, its golden eyes gleaming with unreadable thoughts. "You still doubt," the dragon rumbled. The knight exhaled sharply. "Of course I doubt. I should be dead. Instead, I feel." He paused, struggling to find the right word. "Different." The dragon tilted its head. "Then prove it. Call the flame." The knight frowned. "I don't even know what that means." The dragon let out a low, rumbling growl, stepping back. "Then feel it." Without warning, the ground beneath the knight shook. The air turned heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. Heat surged through his veins, wild and untamed. His breath caught in his throat. Something was happening. A spark flared in his chest, small but real. A flicker of warmth, of power. His body stiffened as the energy inside him surged, clawing at his very being. He gasped, his vision blurring. The warmth became heat, then fire. It burned, not painfully, but like a force demanding to be unleashed. His hands ignited. Golden flames erupted from his fingers, licking up his arms like living creatures. But they didn't burn him. They danced, flickering, waiting for his command. His heart pounded in shock. This wasn't magic. It wasn't a trick. It was real. The dragon's deep voice cut through the silence. "You are the first human to wield the flame. And soon, you will learn what that means." The knight stared at his burning hands, his mind racing. He had spent his life fighting wars, wielding swords, bleeding for causes that had abandoned him. But this was something greater, a power not meant for men. And yet, it was his. He looked up at the dragon, his eyes burning with the same golden fire. "What have you done to me?" The dragon's expression didn't change. "We have given you a gift. But gifts come with purpose. And with purpose comes war." The knight's flames flickered in the dim chamber. A deep certainty settled into his bones. Whatever had been done to him, whatever he had become, there was no going back. And whatever war was coming, he would be ready. The knight's hands still burned with golden fire, but he felt no pain. The flames curled around his fingers, moving as if they were alive. He could feel their warmth, their power. It was intoxicating and terrifying. The massive dragon in front of him watched in silence. Its golden eyes seemed to pierce through his very soul. Power means nothing without control. The knight clenched his fists, extinguishing the flames. His breathing was unsteady. "What do you want from me?" The dragon's massive wings unfurled, sending a gust of hot wind through the chamber. "A warrior must be forged in battle. Your trial begins now." Before the knight could respond, the floor beneath him shifted. The stone cracked, breaking apart. He barely had time to react before he fell. Darkness swallowed him. For a moment, there was nothing. No light, no sound, just the cold air rushing past him as he plunged downward. Then, suddenly, he hit the ground with a force that should have shattered his bones. But instead, he landed on his feet, unharmed. His breath came fast as he took in his surroundings. He was in a vast, open chamber, the walls lined with strange, glowing symbols. The air was thick with heat and the scent of something ancient. And then he heard it, a deep, rumbling growl. His instincts screamed at him to move. He barely dodged in time as a massive shadow lunged at him. Claws scraped the ground where he had just stood. His heart pounded as he got his first clear look at his opponent. It was a beast of fire and stone, a monstrous creature, its body covered in molten cracks, eyes burning with crimson light. It moved like a predator, circling him, testing his reflexes. The knight reached for his sword, only to find nothing. His weapon was gone. The dragon's voice echoed in the chamber. "Fight. Use what we have given you." The beast lunged again, faster this time. The knight rolled to the side, but the heat from the creature's body seared his skin. He gritted his teeth. He was unarmed, outmatched. Unless he focused on the warmth in his chest, the fire inside him. The beast roared and charged once more. This time, the knight didn't run. Instead, he threw out his hand, and golden flames erupted from his palm, slamming into the creature's side. The beast screeched, staggering back. The knight's eyes widened. It worked. The flames hadn't just burned the creature, they had pushed it back. The fire wasn't just an attack. It was force, power, something more than just destruction. The beast recovered quickly, its molten eyes locked onto him with renewed fury. It charged again, but now the knight was ready. He sidestepped the attack and unleashed another blast of fire, this time focusing it into his fist. He struck the beast's side with all his strength. The impact sent a shockwave through the chamber. The beast howled as golden flames tore through its body. Its molten form cracked, splintering apart, until, finally, it collapsed into embers. The chamber fell silent. The knight stood there, panting, his fists still glowing with golden fire. He had won. But the power still surged through him, wild and untamed. Above, the dragon's voice rumbled. "You are learning, but the true test is yet to come." The knight swallowed hard, looking down at his hands. He had barely survived this fight. If this was only the beginning, what would come next? The knight stood motionless, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. The molten beast was gone, reduced to nothing but flickering embers. The golden flames on his hands had dimmed, but they had not disappeared. They still pulsed, alive, waiting. Above him, the ancient dragon watched. Its golden eyes gleamed with something unreadable. Approval, perhaps, or something more dangerous. "You wield power well," the dragon's voice rumbled, "but you are still untested." The knight clenched his fists. "I just defeated a monster made of fire and stone. If that wasn't a test, then what was it?" The dragon let out a low, rumbling chuckle. The ground beneath the knight shook, and suddenly, the walls of the chamber pulled away, revealing an endless void. The knight took a step back, his stomach twisting at the sight. Stars, planets, a swirling expanse of galaxies stretched before him, as if he stood at the edge of the universe itself. Then, they appeared. Silhouettes, shadows moving in the vast nothingness. Tall figures, their eyes glowing like dying embers. Their bodies flickered like phantoms, shifting between solid and mist. The knight felt his heartbeat quicken. Something about them felt wrong. "Who are they?" he asked. The dragon's voice came softer this time, almost sad. "They are the lost, warriors who failed." The knight's breath caught. Failed. The shadows began to move toward him. Slowly, soundlessly. He took a step back, but there was nowhere to run. The void stretched in every direction. The dragon's voice became stern. "You do not fight them with your blade. This is your true trial." The knight's hands trembled. The golden fire sparked around his fingers, but somehow it felt weak against these things. Then the first shadow lunged. The knight raised his arms to defend himself, but the creature didn't strike with claws or fists. Instead, it touched him, and suddenly, he was somewhere else. A battlefield. Screams, smoke, the clash of metal, and the sickening scent of blood. The knight staggered as memories flooded into him. But they weren't his. He saw soldiers, human soldiers, crushed under alien war machines. He saw entire planets burning. He saw defeat, despair. The shadow's voice whispered in his mind, "This is what awaits you. You cannot win." The knight gasped, shoving the shadow away. The battlefield vanished, and he was back in the void. But the figures were closing in, their whispers growing louder. "You are alone. You are weak. You will fail, just as we did." The knight's breathing became ragged. His hands shook. They were inside his head. But then, a different voice, a voice he knew. A warrior's voice, clear and strong. "You are not alone." The knight's eyes snapped open. The golden fire on his hands flared brighter than ever, burning away the shadows that had dared to touch him. The figures recoiled, hissing, their whispers turning into shrieks. The knight took a step forward. "I am not like you." His voice was steady now, strong. "I do not fear failure." The fire around him roared to life, expanding outward in a blinding golden light. The shadows screamed as they were engulfed, their forms dissolving into nothingness. And just like that, the void was gone. The knight was back in the chamber, standing before the great dragon once more. The ancient creature studied him for a long moment before finally speaking. "You have passed." The knight let out a slow breath. He had survived, but at what cost? He could still hear the whispers in his mind. The shadows were gone, but their words lingered. What if they were right? But then, the dragon lowered its head, speaking in a voice so deep it shook the very air. "Now, you are ready." The knight lifted his gaze, eyes burning with determination. Ready for what? The dragon's wings spread wide, casting a massive shadow across the chamber. "For war." The knight stood frozen, the dragon's words still echoing in his mind. "For war." The weight of those words settled heavily on his shoulders, but there was no time to dwell on doubts. The chamber around him trembled as the golden dragon unfurled its massive wings, and in an instant, the world shifted. The stone beneath the knight's feet vanished, and suddenly he was standing elsewhere, not in the chamber, not in the void, but in the heart of something far greater. He found himself on a battlefield, but not one of flesh and blood. The sky above him was torn apart by flames, with monstrous ships looming in the distance, dark shadows blotting out the stars. Armies clashed in the air and on the ground, but what struck the knight the most was not the chaos. It was the presence of dragons. Hundreds, maybe thousands of them, golden, silver, crimson, and obsidian, locked in a desperate struggle against monstrous, twisted beings that seemed more nightmare than reality. These creatures had no form, constantly shifting, flickering between solid and mist, as if they existed between the cracks of the universe itself. The knight barely had time to process what he was seeing when a massive shockwave sent him staggering. From above, a burning dragon fell from the sky, its magnificent wings torn apart by the creatures swarming over it. The knight clenched his fists, feeling his own golden fire surge in response to the horror before him. He had thought himself powerful after his trial, but this was something far beyond anything he had ever imagined. Before he could move, the golden dragon who had brought him here landed beside him, its voice booming across the battlefield. "Now you understand. This is the war you are destined to fight." The knight turned to face the great beast, his mind racing. "What are they?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the dragon knew what he meant. The creatures, the enemy, the things that had reduced even mighty dragons to prey. The dragon's eyes gleamed with something ancient, something filled with sorrow and fury. "They are the devourers. They come from the spaces between realities, where time and life have no meaning. They do not conquer. They consume." As if to emphasize its words, one of the twisted beings latched onto a silver dragon mid-flight, and before the knight's eyes, the majestic creature's form unraveled. It did not die in fire or fury. It simply ceased to exist, as if erased from reality itself. A cold dread settled in the knight's heart. He had fought monsters before, men before, armies before, but never something that could simply erase existence itself. "You expect me to fight that?" he breathed, but the dragon only let out a deep, rumbling sound, not quite a laugh, not quite anger. "You were chosen because you are something they do not understand, a mortal touched by the fire of eternity, a warrior bound to both time and destiny." The knight clenched his fists, feeling the golden flames flicker at his fingertips. He was just a man, A knight who had once pulled out on a forgotten battlefield, abandoned by his own kind. And yet, here he stood, chosen for a war beyond comprehension. Before he could respond, the battlefield erupted around him. The devourers surged forward in a tide of writhing darkness, and the dragons answered with a furious storm of fire and steel. The knight barely had time to react before a shadow loomed over him. One of the creatures had broken through the line, its formless mass twisting into jagged limbs as it lunged. Instinct took over. The knight raised his arms, and the golden flames roared to life, meeting the devourer's attack head-on. There was no clash of steel, no impact of strength against strength. There was only fire. The golden blaze struck the devourer's form, and for the first time, the knight saw something unexpected. The creature screamed, not just in pain, but in something else. Fear. It recoiled, its shifting form splitting apart, unable to withstand the fire that burned not just through flesh, but through reality itself. The knight barely had time to register what had happened before another one lunged. He reacted faster this time, the fire flowing from him like a living force, carving through the abomination in a single searing motion. More came, but with every strike, every flame-forged blow, the knight began to understand. The golden fire within him was not just a weapon. It was the answer. The dragons fought with fury, their flames scorching the heavens, but even they struggled against the endless tide. Yet, as the knight burned through enemy after enemy, he realized something crucial. His flames did not just destroy. They unmade the unmakers. Where the dragon's fire could only harm the creatures, his erased them, severing them from existence, just as they had done to so many others. The golden dragon, still watching from above, let out a sound that was unmistakably approval. Now you see. The knight stood amidst the carnage, his breath ragged, his body burning with power he still barely understood. The devourers had feared his fire. That meant they could be beaten. That meant he could fight this war. But could he win it? As if sensing his thoughts, the golden dragon spread its wings wide, casting a massive shadow across the battlefield. This battle is only the beginning. The real war is yet to come. The knight tightened his grip on the fire pulsing within his veins. Whatever lay ahead, whatever horrors the devourers still held in store, he would not run. He had been abandoned once. He had been left to die. But now he was something more. A knight reborn in fire. The golden flames in his hands burned brighter than ever. And for the first time, the devourers knew fear. The battlefield fell silent, if only for a moment. The knight stood in the ruins of the impossible war, golden fire still flickering along his arms. Around him, the devourers' remains had been reduced to nothing. Not burned, not destroyed, but erased. Their presence had been undone by his fire, leaving behind only the scars of their devastation. The dragons that remained circled above, their massive forms casting long shadows over the ruined land. They had fought valiantly, but even their might had barely been enough to hold back the tide. And yet, the knight had done what even they could not. He had driven the devourers into retreat. The golden dragon descended once more, landing with a force that shook the ground beneath them. Its great eyes burned with something unreadable as it looked upon the human who had once been left for dead, now standing among the stars' greatest warriors. "It is as we feared," the dragon rumbled. "They have seen you now, and they will return." The knight exhaled slowly, his fists tightening at his sides. He had no illusions. This was not victory. It was only the beginning. The sky above rippled, as if reality itself was shifting. The dragons lifted their heads, sensing what the knight could not. And then, in the farthest reaches of the heavens, something moved. Not a fleet, not an army, but something much worse. A presence vast and unknowable, pressing against the edges of existence. The knight did not need to ask what it was. The devourers had noticed him. They had seen what he could do. And they would not let it stand. "What happens now?" the knight asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within him. The golden dragon studied him for a long moment before speaking. Now we prepare. Now we teach you what it means to be a true warrior of fire. The devourers do not forget their enemies, and neither must you. The knight knew there was no going back. He had been given power, but power alone was not enough. He would need to master it, to wield it in ways even the dragons had never imagined. Because when the devourers returned, they would come for him, not to fight, not to destroy, but to erase. And if they thought he would fall so easily, if they thought they could take him without a war unlike any they had ever known, then they had made their final mistake. He had once been a broken warrior, abandoned to die in the mud. Now he was something else entirely. A knight reborn, a warrior of golden fire, and when the devourers came for him, he would be waiting.